This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game where you get to find out what it's like to take control of a real country and lead it in modern global warfare. Set in the early 21st century, Conflict of Nations lets you take full control of a nation and find out what it's like to lead it in modern global warfare. Fight up to 128 other players using everything from combat attack helicopters and airborne infantry units to stealth fighters and even nuclear ballistic submarines. You'll move your units across the map in real time, often taking hours to reach an objective, and game rounds can take weeks to complete. You know that we here at the Military Show love military strategy, and Conflict of Nations gives you the time you need to dive into a deep level of strategic planning and integrated tactical execution. You'll forge alliances and coalitions with other players, which are essential if you want to win. But best of all, you can play with the same account on both PC and mobile to never lose sight of your war. The Military Show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link. But it's only available for 30 days, so click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. The world is splitting into two camps, and it's getting ugly. On one side, NATO, the biggest military machine the world has ever seen. On the other, BRICS, an alliance led by Russia and China, and they're dead set on knocking the West down a few pegs. Both sides are stacking cash, weapons, and allies. Both sides say they're ready for anything. But here's the real question. If it all blows up, who actually wins? Today we're breaking it all down. The money, the weapons, the manpower, and the real balance of power between NATO and BRICS in 2025. First, let's talk about who's been building the biggest military force on Earth for the last 75 years and why it still matters. The NATO alliance expanded during the Cold War to combat the threat posed by the Soviet Union. However, many other countries also joined following the fall of the Soviet Union, reflecting a belief in collective security across Europe. There are now 32 member countries, 30 of which are in Europe, reaching as far east as Turkey. Finland and Sweden joined most recently in 2023 and 2024 respectively, in response to the threat posed by Russia following its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia has long opposed NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe, characterizing it as an act of aggression. NATO also has a Partnership for Peace program that allows the coalition to form individual partnerships with countries that are not members of NATO. This expands NATO's influence beyond Europe and North America. The 32 member states contribute directly to NATO financially based on a cost-sharing program that accounts for gross domestic product and other factors. Member states must also maintain their own military forces and are mandated to contribute at least 2% of their GDP on defense. Currently, only 23 of the 32 nations meet this mandate, but this is up from just 6 countries in 2021, before the start of the war in Ukraine led to a renewed focus on military defense. NATO's 32 member countries cover a land area of 27,580,492 square kilometers and are home to a population of 976.6 million people. BRICS is a very different kind of alliance. The term BRIC was coined by Goldman Sachs in 2001 to refer to the emerging economies of its members. Economist Jim O'Neill suggested that BRIC economic growth could challenge the dominant position of the wealthy G7 nations, all of which, except for Japan, are members of NATO, though Japan works with NATO through the Partnership for Peace program. Those 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, adopted the acronym and formed an intergovernmental organization in 2009, which became BRICS in 2010 when South Africa joined. Since then, the group has expanded to 10 member nations, including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and Indonesia, who joined in 2025. But unlike NATO, the BRICS alliance is informal, with no founding treaty. It's also not primarily a military alliance. Instead, the chairmanship of the group rotates between member countries, and they set an agenda and focus for each year. Their main purpose is economic cooperation, to foster a multipolar world, and to challenge Western dominance of global institutions. One of the BRICS' biggest successes was the foundation of the New Development Bank in 2014, which provides developmental funds, rivaling the Western-led World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Many BRICS nations are critical of these Western-led funds as being guided by Western interests and imposing policies that do not always benefit the countries they purport to help. Despite being an alliance of just 10 countries, the BRICS alliance dwarfs NATO in terms of size and population. It covers a land area of 39,746,220 square kilometers and has a population of 3.64 billion people, which is over 45% of the world's total population. China and India are the 2 most populous nations in the world, each with over 1 billion citizens. Since we're discussing power, it's only natural to look at each group's military. In 2025, NATO has around 3.5 million active service personnel, compared to BRICS' 6.5 million. However, NATO has access to more than 20,000 military aircraft, compared to around 13,000 for the BRICS nations. Since NATO is primarily a military alliance, it requires all member nations to come to the support of other members if they're threatened. The article that stipulates this, Article 4, requires consultation between members if one nation is threatened. It's been invoked multiple times, most recently in 2014 by Poland, a member nation, in response to Russia's annexation of Crimea in Ukraine, a neighboring non-member nation. The move by Russia was seen as an increased threat to all nations in the region. The article was invoked again in 2022 in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine by several Eastern European nations, including Poland, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and Slovakia. However, Article 5, which states that an armed attack against one NATO member is considered an attack against all, has only been invoked once in the alliance's history. That was in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks in the US in 2001 and saw NATO forces active in Afghanistan between 2003 and 2021. However, while the NATO alliance has been strong for more than half a century, its unity is now in question due to President Donald Trump's frequent criticism of NATO and his threats to withdraw the US from the organization made during his first term. He has also suggested that the US might only come to the defense of NATO countries that meet their minimum 2% defense spending requirement. Considering that US defense expenditure represents approximately 2/3 of the alliance's defense spending as a whole, the potential loss of US membership represents a major threat to the alliance. However, the current public stance of the White House is that it fully supports NATO and Article 5. In 2023, Congress also passed legislation requiring them to vote on the withdrawal of the US from NATO. Collectively, NATO has a gross domestic product of around $54 trillion, $24 trillion of which is generated by the US. In 2024, NATO collectively spent $1.4 trillion on defense, which is more than double what it spent 10 years ago, and represents 54% of total global spending on defense. However, the US alone represents 40% of the world's military spending. The BRICS alliance does not have the same requirements for military support, and many member nations will be reluctant to commit to something like that. For example, Brazil gets most of its military equipment from NATO countries and engages in joint military training with NATO members. Under ex-President Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil also became a major non-NATO ally. Consequently, it would be unlikely to commit to a formal BRICS military alliance, as it would undermine its military cooperation with NATO nations. However, it seems that China and Russia may choose to support one another on defense matters. In 2022, China declared that there were no limits to the partnership between the two countries. The same year, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a joint statement criticizing the US on a host of security issues and agreeing to cooperation on nuclear technologies and finance. In July 2024, Russia and China performed joint naval drills in the South China Sea as a display of military might. In response, NATO leaders urged China to reverse its heightened support of Russia. These kinds of interactions have led to talks of a new Cold War, or a Cold War 2.0, between NATO and a Russia-China alliance. China is by far the biggest player in the BRICS group, representing 70% of the group's GDP, which collectively is around $30 trillion. China also represents around 12% of global military spending and almost 50% of BRICS military spending. Despite growing tensions around the world, it's unlikely that we'll see a standoff between NATO and BRICS in the near future, but a conflict between NATO and combined Russian and Chinese forces is more likely. But if we did see a showdown between NATO and BRICS on the battlefield, who would have the military edge? Starting with underlying resources, NATO members have a combined GDP of $54 trillion. $1.4 trillion of which is already spent on defense. Further resources could be redirected, giving NATO a significant economic edge. In comparison, BRICS countries have a collective GDP of around $24 trillion, of which around $470 billion is currently spent on defense. While this does leave the BRICS nations behind, they have the advantage of 436 billion barrels of oil in reserve versus 233.9 billion barrels for NATO. Similarly, they have almost 100,000 kilometers of natural gas reserves versus 17,500 kilometers cubed for NATO. The war in Ukraine has already shown the potentially destabilizing effects of fuel shortages after Russia cut natural gas supplies to the West. We've mentioned the number of active military personnel for each group, 6.5 million for BRICS versus just under 3.5 million for NATO. But BRICS ground forces would also have an advantage in military equipment. BRICS has access to over 33,000 tanks versus 11,700 for NATO. The two sides have a roughly even number of armored vehicles in general, 869,475 for NATO versus 708,756 for BRICS. However, the BRICS nations have almost 18,000 towed artillery units and 13,000 self-propelled artillery units, versus 6,500 towed artillery units for NATO and 4,788 self-propelled units. Similarly, while NATO reportedly has 1,944 multi-launch rocket systems, BRICS countries have a staggering 9,261, mostly in possession of Russia and China. But these days, wars are rarely won or lost on the ground. Joint Russian and Chinese naval exercises show the importance of maritime power in modern warfare. So who would have the advantage at sea? The NATO and BRICS navy fleets are similar in size, with the NATO fleets slightly outnumbering BRICS, 2,857 ships to 2,306 ships respectively. However, the composition of their navies is notable. NATO has more large ships, including 95 heavily armed destroyers and 134 large but maneuverable frigates, versus 75 destroyers and 96 frigates for BRICS. The BRICS fleet will have to rely on more nimble vessels, such as corvettes, of which they have 194 versus NATO's 94. Below the surface, the BRICS fleet has a greater number of submarines, 178 to NATO's 144. These offer stealth and strategic advantages and are often called the queens of the chessboard because of their maneuverability. Many submarines are also armed with nuclear weapons, increasing their level of threat. Despite this, observers suggest that NATO's navy has the edge due to the overall quality and combat capability of its fleet, especially when it comes to destroyers and guided missile cruisers. The NATO Navy fleet also includes 29 aircraft carriers versus 11 for BRICS, which brings us to who has the edge in air support for ground and sea operations. NATO has access to over 20,000 total aircraft versus 13,000 for BRICS. However, within those fleets, both sides have a similar number of combat vessels. NATO has 3,451 fighter aircraft versus 3,216 for BRICS. NATO has 1,165 attack aircraft compared to 1,432 for BRICS. However, NATO has 937 special aircraft, more than double the 403 available for BRICS. The NATO Air Force is also considered technologically superior, largely thanks to the US contribution. The NATO Air Force has greater stealth capabilities, especially in its F-22 and F-35 fighters. They also have a wider range of air bases around the world, giving them greater flexibility of operation. But what if the conflict escalated to the point of the unthinkable? Specifically, where do NATO and BRICS match up in terms of a nuclear deterrent? NATO has access to an estimated 5,559 nuclear weapons, compared to 6,252 among the BRICS nations. NATO's nuclear weapons are limited to 3 countries, known as the P3, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. Coincidentally, BRICS' nuclear capabilities are also in the hands of 3 member states, Russia, China, and India. India has not signed the International Non-Proliferation Treaty for nuclear weapons and does not participate in the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, so it's not often listed as a nuclear country despite having nuclear weapons. Because they're a military alliance, NATO expands the nuclear threat, since there is the potential that one of the 3 members that possess nuclear weapons could use them if any of the 32 nations are threatened. Notably, the US is the only nation to have used nuclear weapons in war to date, following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The level of technology possessed by NATO is believed to give them a secure advantage, at least for now, due to the superiority of its military equipment and vast global missile defense network. But China in particular is modernizing quickly and as such represents an increasingly formidable threat, especially if the fight were to erupt close to their shores, such as a conflict for control of Taiwan. China has long claimed that Taiwan is part of its territory and has made no secret of its intentions to fully integrate the country, which they claim is an internal Chinese issue. To that end, in December 2024, China carried out a sweeping military operation in the Western Pacific and around Taiwan, a significant show of force. They simulated attacking foreign ships trying to break a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. It's unclear how NATO would respond if China chose to invade Taiwan. The US officially takes no position on the sovereignty of Taiwan, however, it has stated that it opposes any changes to the current status quo. To demonstrate that, the US sailed a destroyer through the sea corridor between China and Taiwan in April 2025 as their own show of force. Overall, the military resources available to NATO appear to give it a slight edge over BRICS in a military conflict, but the 2 forces are so evenly matched that any conflict will be drawn out, costly, and deadly. In the more likely event of a conflict between NATO and an alliance of Russia and China only, the 2 sides would still be relatively close in military might, since Russia and China represent the bulk of military powers in the BRICS group. The pair of nations would have a combined defense budget of around $400 billion and could draw on 2.2 million active military personnel. Ground forces would have access to 12,000 tanks, 5,755 rocket projectors, and 1,200 ballistic missile launchers. Their naval fleet would be modest with around 1,200 ships, but would include 124 submarines. They could muster 7,500 military aircraft, including 3,500 combat planes, that would all be supported by significant nuclear armaments. But what if the US pulled out of NATO, or decided not to honor a call for assistance? Remember, Trump refused to back a UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine early in 2025. So what if Russia's activities in Ukraine provoked an all-out conflict between a Russia-China alliance and a NATO without US resources? Without the US, NATO's principal strength would be its air power. While its fleet would be greatly reduced, it would still have more advanced technology and better trained pilots. While the US possesses more than half of NATO's fighter jet arsenal, NATO would still have formidable French-made Rafale jets, Swedish Gripens, and the Eurofighter Typhoon. However, they would have far fewer tankers to refuel these planes. In addition, the US dominates in providing ground-based air defense systems, which would leave NATO forces more vulnerable to air attacks. Moreover, recent US restrictions on sharing intelligence with Ukraine showed that non-US weapon systems such as the British Storm Shadow missile system cannot be employed without US-provided targeting data. NATO ground forces would also be significantly reduced without US support. NATO would lose around 40% of its active military personnel and 60% of its tanks. Moreover, the US is the only NATO member that can quickly deploy teams of 3 divisions or more. The loss of this fast and formidable deployment would reduce NATO's ability to project power outside its immediate territories. However, naval forces would be even harder hit. NATO would be left with a significantly reduced navy, particularly with regard to aircraft carriers and submarines. The withdrawal of the US would therefore make a NATO versus Russia and China conflict very challenging for NATO, though the UK and France's nuclear capabilities would remain a strong deterrent. In March 2025, French President Emmanuel Macron publicly stated that he would be willing to extend the protection of France's nuclear arsenal to its NATO partners in Europe if the United States decided not to remain by our side in the war in Ukraine. Russian representatives called this type of language a clear threat. This raises the question of whether NATO can function without the US. It would certainly be challenging because NATO was built around the US as its backbone in terms of essential activities. For example, the US provides key sensors, effectors, and command and control infrastructure for NATO to defend against missile threats. While NATO could fill those gaps, it would take time, and it's unclear how quickly NATO would adapt if the US unexpectedly pulled out during a conflict. What do you think? Who would win in a conflict between NATO and BRICS? Or who would win in a more likely conflict between NATO and a Russia-China alliance? In addition, if the United States decided to change its position on NATO, what would that mean for NATO's prospects? How likely is the United States to challenge its relationship with NATO? Tell us your opinions in the comments section below, and thank you for watching the video. Thanks again to our sponsor Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free by using the link. It's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Choose your country and start fighting your way to victory right now.